Hello, I'm Richard Velleman and I'm one of the originators of the 5-step method. This video is going to cover two things. First, the preparatory work that needs to be undertaken before starting a 5-step method intervention. And then second, the delivery of step 1, including a discussion of the key things that we have learnt which make a good step 1 and a discussion of common pitfalls and how to avoid them. So there are a number of key things that every practitioner should ensure are completed before starting a 5-step method intervention with a family member. And these things are essentially the same, regardless of whether the work is being done face-to-face or using some video conferencing system such as Zoom, and regardless of whether the work is being done individually or in a group format. First, the practitioner should introduce the intervention to a family member and go through with them what it will involve before agreeing with a family member how the work will be undertaken, such as face-to-face or by Zoom, and whether we'll meet fortnightly or weekly or whatever. Second, practitioners should discuss the use of the family member self-help handbook to support the work that will be done. They should also check whether the family member's living arrangements are such that they can take the handbook home with them, or whether it might need to be kept somewhere else. As an example, some family members don't want their alcohol or drug or gambling using relative to know that they're receiving help, in which case it might not be sensible for them to take the handbook or other information home with them. Third, a practitioner should complete all the required paperwork, and there are two elements to this. First, we need to complete everything that is required by the organisation or agency within which we work. For example, this might include the organisation's initial assessment, or their risk assessment, or their confidentiality statement, any information sharing systems, and so on. And second, and crucially, we need to ensure that the family member is asked to complete the family member questionnaire. It is possible to complete the family member questionnaire at the beginning of step 1 itself, but if possible, we think that it's better done beforehand as there's already so much that needs to be covered during step 1. Fourth, a practitioner should continue to familiarise themselves with the intervention and make good use of all the resources that they have available to them, such as the handbooks, the self-help one I've mentioned, and also the professional handbook, the journal articles that you'll have seen, the competency framework, and the checklist and common problems documents that we've developed to supplement to the use of the competencies framework, and of course these videos, one of which you're now watching. Finally, practitioners should ensure that they have access to clinical supervision to support their work and be fully versed in the procedures to follow if any issues of risk arise. Okay, let's move on to step 1. And step 1 is incredibly important. Step 1 is about encouraging the family member to tell their story, about listening carefully and encouragingly, about reassuring the family member, and about exploring with them what their concerns are. Now, some practitioners have told us that they can sometimes feel as if they are not doing anything during step 1, and yet countless affected family members have reported that step 1 is often the most important part of the intervention for them, because they value being listened to in a non-judgmental way and having the opportunity to tell their story. Many family members have told us that this has been one of the very first times, or even the very first time, that they have ever had the opportunity to talk about these issues. And this in itself can affect change and can lead to the positive future changes that are possible when working through the rest of the steps of the intervention. So take a look at the quote from a family member on this slide. So many family members really appreciate the chance to be listened to in a non-judgmental way. In terms of the stress-strain coping support model that underpins the 5-step method, which is shown on the left-hand side of the slide, step 1 is about exploring the stresses that each family member is experiencing and clarifying the strain that it is causing them. And this must be done well, and it must be done fully before moving on to the subsequent steps, which are about empowering the family member to think about information, about coping, and about support, and how change in any or all of these 3 areas can reduce their stress and their strain. In addition to your use of both the practitioner handbook and the competency framework to guide your work in each of the 5-step method sessions, you should also remember to refer to the self-help handbook if you have agreed with a family member that you will be using this to support the work, and to refer to the relevant section or sections of the family member questionnaire. There are exercises in the practitioner and the self-help handbooks that can be used to support this step. And remember, as practitioners, we use the competency framework to ensure that we provide the necessary and helpful structure to the session, while also ensuring that the family member remains in control of what is talked about, the content of the session. This is the case all the way through the 5-step method and is especially important in step 1. As the first session, it demonstrates to the family member how the 5-step method works. And we do have some tips to share about how best to undertake step 1. As the slide shows, step 1 is about identifying the stresses that this family member is experiencing, and also identifying the strain, the way that these stresses affect both this family member and others in the family. Now, you may think that it is obvious what the stresses are, and that it's obvious why and how these stresses cause strain. But actually, it may not be obvious. Everyone experiences things very differently, so we must not generalize from our experience of working with other family members, but we need to concentrate on this family member and what the stresses are for them and how these stresses affect them. It's also important not to rush this step. Some family members may find it difficult to talk about themselves and how they've been affected. Some will feel that their only justification for seeking help is to seek help for their relative and not for themselves. And many will fear being blamed or judged either for causing the problem or for them continuing. So we need to reassure, we need to ask questions, we need to not judge and enable them to talk. And whereas some family members find it difficult to talk, others may only talk about their relative and how he or she developed their problem and how they are now. So we need to use our core counselling skills to help them keep on track and to guide them via our use of summaries and probing questions, guide them into talking about how the behaviour of their relative has impacted on them, the affected family member. And of course, we need to be alert for the things that they may not be saying, so we can help them. So we can help them say some of these things by our gentle use of probing questions. We know that some stresses are more common in some groups. That's not to say all people in any group will experience every form of stress that's common in that group, but it's useful to know that parents often feel a failure, partners are often more at risk of domestic abuse, children are often very frightened and confused, and usually, as people have not spoken to others about these things, they do not know how common these experiences are. So one key task of step 1, and indeed of many steps, is to normalize these experiences, to say to people, I've heard many other family members say these things. These are very common experiences amongst affected family members. And a final tip is to start to pull out from what the family member is saying, what some of their information needs might be. And at the end of this step, to check out whether you've got that right so that you and they can start to prepare for step 2, which is about information. So to sum up, there's some key things to remember when preparing for step 1 and then in undertaking step 1. First, there are key practical and preparation issues as shown on the left-hand side. You may want to have an initial preparatory session where you explain the 5-step method and where you complete the paperwork like the consent form for sharing the FMQ and recording the sessions, and you want to fill in the FMQ, the family member questionnaire. Or you may want to send the consent and information form sheets by post if that works better, or email them to people, and so on and so forth. And in planning your session, you've got to ensure that you have enough time and make sure you've informed the family member how long this first session may take so that they don't run out of time. And it's a very good idea to have a clock in the room so you can keep track of time and see how much time you have left. And obviously ensure that you've both turned your phones off. And before you start, make sure that you have all of the materials that you need to hand before you start the session. Things like having a copy of the self-help handbook to give to the family member, ensuring you have the competency framework or the shorter checklist to hand so you can make sure you've covered everything and so on. And then when you do start, make sure you set an agenda and explain the structure, explain the stress, strain, coping support model and the 5-step method that comes from it. And then you go over, again, if necessary, confidentiality. And although there are key areas to cover in step 1 explained in the competency framework, never forget the core counselling competencies. Always have a warm welcome and always remember the 4 key principles. Listen actively, develop empathy, allow and deal with emotions, express and promote realistic optimism. And always remember to both give a copy of the self-help handbook, having checked that it's safe for them to take it home, and to use the self-help handbook, both in the sessions and remind them to use it in between as homework. So in this slide is an example of how you might use the self-help handbook in relation to step 1, showing the first 2 exercises. The first exercise is aimed at helping the family member to identify what it is about the behaviour of the relative with a problem that's causing them the stress. And then the second exercise is about helping the family member clarify how that stress is then affecting them, the affected family member who you're working with. Now, I've mentioned the 5-step method competency framework. This framework lists out the core competencies for each step of the 5-step method and also lists out the core counselling competencies which need to be demonstrated throughout the whole of the 5-step method intervention. The competency framework will help guide you through the process of step 1. This slide indicates that there are 6 criteria to cover in step 1. These are the beginning of the session, supporting the family member to tell their story and explore their concerns, identify all the relevant stressors and how both the affected family member and other people in the family have been affected, normalize the experiences of the affected family member, and then ending the session. And each of these competencies have a number of tasks within them, as outlined in the slide and in a bit more detail in the competency framework. And in addition to all of these criteria, all of the core counselling skills must be fully utilised throughout the session, as shown in point 7 in the slide. Now, we discuss the 5 core counselling competencies in another video clip, but to summarise by way of a reminder, they are building a trusting relationship with the affected family member, careful listening and summarising, allowing silences and the expression of emotion, offering positive encouragement, and the clarification of risk and safety. Essentially, throughout step 1, a practitioner should aim to keep the focus on step 1 at all times and not to jump ahead to providing information or exploring coping or support. And if step 1 is done well and comprehensively, then it lays the groundwork, the foundation for all that will be done in subsequent sessions. Now, I want to look in a little more detail now at the sets of competencies listed here under number 1, beginning the session, and number 6, ending the session. It's always important to remember that the 5-step method is a semi-structured intervention. It's semi, not completely structured, because the whole intervention is not manualized, where everything that a practitioner might say is written down and the order that they need to say it is also prescribed. But it's still structured, because there are specific tasks that need to be covered in each step. And these are all laid down in the competency framework. So it's essential for the practitioner to remember that this structure creates a process that they need to keep to. That's why we have this adage that the practitioner is in control of the process and the family member is in control of the content. That is, we are in charge of ensuring that we empower and assist the family member to progress through each step, through all of the necessary elements within each step, but that what is talked about, the detail of the stresses and the resulting strain in this first step, or in later steps, the details of what information is needed, or issues about coping or support, do not come from us, but instead come from the family member. We control the process, but the family member controls the content. Now, over the years, we've started to emphasize this process more and more and as we've learned more about the importance of structuring the sessions of a 5-step method intervention. As part of the structure, we've learned that two of the key things in providing a successful and useful session are to get the start and the end of each session right. And we have found that there are some essential things to cover at the start and then again at the end of each session. And so a practitioner should aim to spend at least 5 minutes at the start and at least 5 minutes at the end of each session to cover all that's required. Having a structure in place ensures that a practitioner can maintain focus throughout each session. It is generally also really helpful to inform affected family members about the way each session will be structured, as this can help them focus, which then maximizes how much they get out of each session. So this slide in front of us now outlines the key things to be covered at the start of every session, although this slide is oriented to the start of step 1. Obviously, there are slight changes in each one. So this is oriented to step 1, but basically you cover all these things at the start of every session. So at the beginning of step 1, practitioners should always warmly welcome the family member, set a clear and structured agenda for the session, communicate this to the family member, and ensure that this agenda is followed throughout the session. Remind the family member what the 5-step method is and summarize what it involves. Remind the family member about confidentiality. Give an overview of step 1 and how it relates to the stress-strain coping support model. Refer to the handbook if we've agreed that it's going to be used to support our work. And complete the family member questionnaire if that's not already been done. The start of the session can also be a good time to check in with the family member about risk and safety. And this next slide outlines the key things to be covered at the end of each session, although again, this slide is oriented towards the end of step 1. So at the end of step 1, practitioners should summarize the main issues that have been discussed, check if the session was helpful, check in with the family member about risk and safety if it hasn't already been sufficiently covered, agree the ongoing use of the self-help handbook if that's being used, summarize the purpose of the next session, in this case step 2, and start to identify what the questions and information needs might be, and agree the practicalities of the next session.